What's up, everybody? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden, and I'm doing Chapter 2 of Matt Taibbi's book, The Divide. That's it right there. Finished it yesterday. And basically, the first chapter was about how these enormous financial institutions that crashed our economy back in 2008 and really are continuing to crash it with their Wall Street banking practices and gambling on the stock market and, committing fraud and embezzlement and all these things that cause our economy to collapse routinely. They never saw the inside of a jail cell, and the reason for that is that a lot of these big corporations allow their executives corporate finances, like the money that they make as a corporation, available to these people so that they can defend themselves in court. And they also use a human shield approach where they say to anybody that might be a federal prosecutor looking into them for doing all these crimes, if you jail me, if you jail this whole board and all the people that are executives at this firm, the firm's going to go under, and that's going to put tens of thousands of people out of work. So a lot of times federal prosecutors won't go after these large corporations because they have all these fail-safes set up so that they really can't see the inside of a jail cell. Now, the second chapter starts off with a guy I alluded to in the last episode. His name is Maroney, Tory Maroney, and he's a young white gentleman who was more or less homeless, and he ended up spending 45 days or a month and a half or so at Rikers Island in New York, because when he was sleeping outside on a park bench one night, some cops woke him up, told him to leave the park because it was out past curfew, and he started to leave. And then they started to write him a citation for more or less nothing. He flipped out because he was being written a citation even though he was leaving the park. And then the cops arrested him, said he was resisting arrest, and then they found a small roach of marijuana in his pocket. And even though he never really broke the law, and he really wasn't even breaking the law, just sleeping on the park bench, that ended up leading down the rabbit hole, which happens to so many of us poor folk, into spending a month and a half, and that was a plea, at Rikers Island, which is one of the nastiest prisons in the country. It's ruthless there. So why is it so different for somebody like Tory Maroney and some of these enormous executives from these Wall Street firms that crashed our economy? And in the second chapter, Frisk Stop is what it's called. Matt Taibbi really contrasts this well. He goes, the first part is he's talking more about Tory Maroney, and I just kind of told you what happened with him. And then we're going to go over the second and the third part of the chapter, which the middle part talks about UBS, which is the Swiss bank that back in 2012, late 2012, was let off of one of the biggest price-fixing scandals for a mere $1.5 billion fine and a non-prosecution. So they were let off the hook entirely. And then the third part, Taibbi goes and talks about two young gentlemen who were in the South Bronx. They're young black guys, and they were just driving around in a car that looked too expensive for them to be driving it, and they were arrested. Their Fourth Amendment rights were broken, and I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened to them and why that's so messed up. So Tory Maroney spent 40-something odd days in Rikers Island for just having a marijuana joint on him. But he was being arrested by cops. They shouldn't have even been arresting him. They shouldn't have even been citing him for laying on the park bench. But that led to a cascade of events which led to prison time because he happened to be poor. Second part, UBS. And I'm going to actually read to you what Eric Holder, he was the guy that I talked about in the first chapter. In 1999, he was in the White House, and he did the Holder memo. At this point in the story, this is like a decade and a half later, he's in the Obama administration as Attorney General. And I'm going to talk about him and his right-hand man, Lanny Brewer, who's the Attorney General assistant. They basically ran out the collateral consequences paradigm, which is the idea that nowadays if you go after one of these big banks and you actually successfully prosecute them, it'll cause a cascade in our markets to cause basically the whole global market to fail. So you can't go after these banks. And I'm going to read to you exactly what happened or what Eric Holder said right after that UBS settlement of $1.5 billion, which is nothing to UBS, pocket change to UBS, came out. They basically, him and Brewer, ran with the collateral consequences idea and modernized it. It came from his original memo, which was like 13 years beforehand. So I'm going to read to you here exactly what they said. Collateral consequences was out of the bag. After years and years of mysterious non-prosecutions and expertly negotiated cost of doing business fines, we finally had the policy that it all led to. And once it was out, it seemed that the Justice Department was anxious to make sure that the public understood that it was no slip of the tongue. After UBS, both Brewer and Holder took collateral consequences on a kind of public relations tour, beginning with an episode of PBS's Frontline that aired a few weeks after the UBS settlement of $1.5 billion in January 2013. In that show, Brewer gave a detailed interview on the subject. Quote, "In any given case, I think I and prosecutors around the country being responsible should speak to regulators, should speak to experts," he said. "Because if I bring a case against institution A, and as a result of bringing that case there's some huge economic effect, if it creates a ripple effect so that suddenly counterparties and other financial institutions or other companies that had nothing to do with this are affected badly, it's a factor we need to know and understand," end quote. Now, this is the other thing that they're admitting to, beyond the idea that they're not going to go after these banks because of the, butterfly effect, that it would, take down the world economy or anything like that. It's also that they argue that they have to go and ask Wall Street before they even think about bringing charges against Wall Street, their opinion on how bad the fallout would be taking down Institution A. So, like, what they will do is that they will go ask people at Goldman Sachs if they think it would be a good thing if we persecuted Goldman Sachs and how big the fallout would be. It's fox guarding the henhouse reasoning. So that's the other thing that they admitted here, is not just that they're not going to persecute these enormous banks for reasons A, B, and C I've laid out, but they will also, as far as gauging which banks are too big to fail and which are just big enough to prosecute, they'll go ask the too big to fail banks, who they think the banks that are big enough to actually prosecute are. So, it's so bad, guys. So I'm going to continue to read here. Brewer was here repeating Holder's mantra that before moving against an industry target, the Justice Department essentially had to ask industry experts for advice. Exactly. He was also now expanding the possible collateral consequences to include a ripple effect that would impact the whole economy, including innocent victims, not just within the target firm, but perhaps also in other firms as well. If we press charges, in other words, we just don't know what might happen to everybody. We were now officially in the realm of an Edward Lorenz butterfly effect theory of crime fighting. A single indictment might be felt all the way around the world, and forever. Now, I'm going to talk to you exactly about what Holder said here. It's on the next page here. Chuck Grassley and Sherrod Brown pressed on Brewer and Holder after this. They were, you know who those guys are. Grassley told Holder he couldn't recall any high-profile prosecutions that led to any high-profile financial criminal convictions in either companies or individuals, he asked Holder to explain. Notably, Holder pulled out collateral consequences as an answer to this question about not just companies but individuals. Quote, "I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it becomes difficult for us to prosecute them." Holder, during this Senate hearing, did not mention that he had come up with this idea 14 years earlier, long before too big to fail was even imaginable. He went on, "The problem comes," he said, quote, "when we are hit with indications that if you do prosecute, if you do bring criminal charges, it will have a negative impact on the national economy, perhaps even the world economy." So he's giving away the game there, and he's making it very clear that, like, some banks, some financial institutions, and indeed other institutions that aren't even financial are just simply too big and have too much influence, and there would be too much fallout if they were to go under to prosecute with criminal charges. So that's what Holder actually had to say on that. And then it goes through other stuff in that part of the chapter about other banks that were caught with their hand in the cookie jar and get 4 or 5 weeks worth of their net revenue taken away via fine, but then they get slapped on the wrist with a $1 billion fine, but then they make $25 billion in a year. So, like, or 50 billion in a year. So it's nothing. That's the only way they go after them, and it's less than a slap on the wrist. So then he changes gears, Taibbi does, and he talks about these two gentlemen who were caught in a Land Rover or Range Rover in the wrong part of the South Bronx. They were profiled, black gentlemen, as being likely to be in possession of marijuana, or maybe there would be you know how police profile. They always shake down people that they're likely to find a small amount of drugs on, or maybe an unlicensed weapon, or silly crimes, easy crimes to write citations for or to make an arrest on that are not dangerous. So these two guys ended up being thrown into a van, literally taken out of their land, pulled over, taken out of their SUV, thrown into a van, and collected over the period of an afternoon with like 6 or 7 other people, junkies, people from the streets, and just thrown into a van without being read their rights and driven all around, and then eventually taken to the precinct. Now, what they were doing is plainclothes police officers are called ghosts, and they will go out and specifically try to look for groups of people who are likely to be caught in the net that I just talked to you about. They are likely to have maybe a little bit of drugs on them, so like tweakers, homeless people, or are just likely to be in violation of some other minor charge. And then what they'll do is they'll radio to a van that's in the area. The van will show up and throw those people in the back of the van and then take them down to the precinct, even though they haven't actually committed any crimes. They're just the people that the police have profiled as being the likeliest to commit one of the crimes I just mentioned. And these two gentlemen got thrown in with a whole bunch of other people. They got taken down to the precinct, and they were officially kind of given the charge of suspicion of being in possession of marijuana. Okay? And they had to fight through the courts. Many times they were told to take a plea and just plead to the $25 fine and 2 hours community service, and they refused. The joint was never found. They never found any marijuana on them, and after a year, the two gentlemen finally were able to get exonerated and get the charges dropped on them. But the system did everything it could to get these two gentlemen who were completely innocent to plead to something. And most people do, because they just don't want to have to deal with the year-long fight of it, right? So they take the $25 fine and plead guilty to the suspicion of marijuana use or the possession of marijuana in small amounts. So they had to fight for a year to get these charges dropped. But one of the gentlemen had a job lined up before the felony arrest, right? And he lost his job, or lost that opportunity to get that job, because he now had the felony arrest and he was dealing with the court system. By the time that gets dropped off of his record, the job's already gone. So the fallout is that he didn't end up with the job. It was a bogus arrest, and it was it's against his Fourth Amendment rights. And they routinely do this, not just in New York, but we know that they have quotas, and they want you to bring back, in this book, he claims that the cops were looking to bring back 1 body per cop. That's the quote in there, 1 body per cop. So they go out, they have a ghost who's a friend on their squad at the police, go and pick some people that are maybe likeliest to have a small amount of drugs on them or an unlicensed weapon, something stupid like that, and they say, oh, go pick up this person. Van shows up, grabs the person, and they don't even always get the right person, by the way. Like, a lot of times the van shows up a little bit later and picks up somebody else on that corner who looks like the description that was just given. So they end up throwing all these people in there that aren't even the original, like, radioed back identities or bodies. So why does he bring this up? Taibbi's showing that there's a stark contrast between the rights that you're allowed in this country constitutionally, depending on how much money you have. And it can't be starker than this. The fox is literally guarding the henhouse when it comes to Wall Street regulating themselves and making sure that none of them see the inside of a jail cell. Meanwhile, they fund things in this country like a prison industrial complex, which they also profit from, and a militarized police that will go out and make sure that all the poor people are getting rounded up for even the minor offenses. But worse than that, all that they're doing with this ghost and van program is they're breaking your Fourth Amendment rights to cast a wide net over people that they think might have committed crimes, and then they strong-arm them after they've arrested them against their rights into taking a plea bargain on something that they never would have been caught for had they not been thrown in the back of a van for nothing in the first place. So they're casting a wide net and shaking it and seeing what sticks. That's unconstitutional. And it's only happening to these people because they're poor. So that's basically the Frisk Stop chapter, and you can see it's aptly named. The book is great so far. I highly recommend you reading Matt Taibbi. He's kind of like Hunter S. Thompson. He's very funny and hard-hitting in his journalism, and I will read the third chapter over the next couple of days. It's a bit longer. I think it's almost 100 pages. So I'll get back to the book, we'll see, 4 or 5 days. So keep fighting the good fight out there, guys. I'll talk to you later.